Billionaire chases a girl who stole his wallet. What he saw left him in tears. On a sweltering summer afternoon in the heart of Manhattan, where every crack in the sidewalk seemed to echo with hurried footsteps, a man stepped out of a gleaming glass tower, the kind of place where only those with power and money came and went as if by right. The deep navy suit he wore was tailored with such precision it seemed to slice the very air as he moved. Richard Callahan, 58 years old, was a name spoken with a kind of careful reverence in the world of Wall Street finance, a man others mentioned only with a hint of caution. He adjusted his cufflinks, cast a swift glance at the platinum watch on his wrist, and stepped toward the curb to hail a car. But in that very moment, it happened. A sudden jolt, light as a whisper. A small girl, wearing a hooded sweatshirt, thin and quick as a shadow, slammed into him and vanished into the crowd like a wisp of smoke. At first, he merely frowned, thinking it just another bump in the chaos of a city that never left room to breathe. But instinct made him reach for the inside pocket of his jacket. It was empty. The wallet was gone. His heart clenched for a moment, not because of the lost money, but because of the public audacity. In his entire life, Richard had never been outplayed, especially not on his own turf, and New York was his arena. Without pausing, he scanned the crowd, and within seconds he caught a glimpse of that small frame weaving through the rush like flowing water. The girl was not running the way mischievous children run, or the way truants flee school. She ran like someone who had done this many times before, fluid, calculated, knowing exactly when to slip through a gap and when to pause. Richard gave chase without a word of hesitation. Amid the blaring horns and thick scent of gasoline, he felt something stir in him, something that hadn't moved in decades. It was as if he were back in his younger years, training for boxing matches at the elite athletic club in Midtown. But this was no ring. There were no cheers. Only a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, and a girl running as though her very survival depended on the rhythm of her feet. We will come to the moment when he could have stopped, and will speak of why he did not. Why a man like Richard Callahan chose to run after a pickpocket through the very heart of the city. And more importantly, what happened when he finally saw her face in a narrow alley behind an old corner store where the light could not reach the truth that waited in the shadows. But let us save that for a little later. For now, leave a comment below and share where you're listening from, so we'll know this story has found you, wherever you are in the world. Because this story might just change the way you see the world, how you understand compassion, and how you notice the people we so often pass by without ever truly seeing. And if something in this story stirred something within you, if a part of it made you think of yourself or someone you love, consider subscribing to Emotional Echoes, liking this video, and sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. Someone who needs their heart to be touched, just like you. Because every share, every comment from you is the reason we continue to bring these raw, heartfelt, and deeply human stories to life each and every day. And now, let us return to the chase unfolding in the tension-filled veins of New York City. Because what happens next might make you see life through an entirely different set of eyes. Richard gave chase, his long strides tearing through the frantic rhythm of Manhattan's sidewalk as though trying to rewrite its very pulse. The crowd on either side didn't so much as turn their heads. They were far too accustomed to the city's relentless motion to bother with someone shouting or sprinting past. Ahead of him, the girl was nothing more than a flicker of motion, gliding like wind. She knew precisely when to duck beneath a stranger's arm, when to press herself flat against the curb to avoid being caught. She never looked back. She didn't have to. The certainty in her steps said it all. They were confident, agile, and carried the faint, unsettling grace of danger. Richard had never had his wallet stolen in broad daylight. Everything he owned was meticulously guarded, from bank accounts to private meetings. And yet here he was, chasing a child no older than his daughter once was, charging through the exhaust-choked blur of Fifth Avenue as though his very dignity were under siege. He didn't understand why the moment gripped him so fiercely. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was age and the bitterness that comes with the creeping suspicion that others see you as slow or weak. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something in the fleeting glance he'd caught of her eyes that made turning back impossible. She darted across the street, narrowly avoiding a taxi that screeched to a halt. The driver cursed, but didn't stop. Neither did Richard. One hand pushed back the flapping edge of his coat, the other clenched the side pocket of his slacks, already tugged loose from the sprint. His breath was growing shallow. Nearly 60 was not the age to be racing through city streets, but he didn't stop. The girl veered into a narrow alleyway, wedged between two towering buildings, where sunlight filtered through in fragmented shafts that barely kissed the ground. Richard followed, slowing just enough to maintain the gap without losing her. She slipped past overflowing trash bins, vaulted a discarded pile of lumber, and squeezed herself through a narrow break between two rusted trucks. Her shoes scraped across the cement with a dry, rasping drag. Richard felt a sharp flare in his right knee, an old boxing injury from his youth returning with cruel precision, but he clenched his jaw and pressed on. Nowhere else in his life had he ever felt himself pulled so abruptly out of his carefully fortified comfort. The blocks flew past like scenes from a film fast-forwarded, the world streaked with movement. Dusty glass-front diners, flickering LED signs above cramped bodegas, brick walls soaked in layers of graffiti. No one intervened, no one asked questions. This was New York, where everyone was too preoccupied with their own survival to bother with someone else's chase. She turned again, cutting into a narrower path flanked by old brick walls and iron fire escapes that hung above like skeletal ladders. Richard was gasping now, his white shirt clinging damp against his back, sweat trickling down his spine. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. He still didn't know exactly why. It wasn't just the wallet anymore, not just the sting of insult. Something about her had gripped him in a place he hadn't known was still raw. She slipped through a chain-link gate, not quite closed, pushing it open and gliding through like a cat. Richard arrived moments later. The gate swung back and slammed into his shoulder, but he pushed through. Then he heard it. A stumble. A small cry of pain echoing from the far end of the alley. The distance had finally narrowed. He slowed his pace, heart pounding, not just with exertion, but with something growing inside his chest. A feeling he couldn't quite name, but strong enough to keep him from pulling out his phone to call the police. And then, as he rounded the final corner, he saw her, huddled on the dirty concrete, one hand clutching a scraped knee, the other wrapped tightly around his wallet, pressing it to her chest as if it were the last thing she had left in the world. Her eyes lifted to meet his. There was no defiance, no shame, just exhaustion. An exhaustion Richard had never seen in a child before. And in that instant, something inside him came to a halt. The anger melted away. All that remained was a question. Richard stood about 10 paces away from the girl, his breath still unsteady after the chase he should never have attempted at the age of 58. The dead-end alley reeked of old oil and discarded waste from the nearby market. Brick walls crumbled under a film of moss, and the heavy scent of dampness thickened the air. She remained there, back pressed against the wall at the alley's end, legs drawn in, one knee scraped and bleeding slowly. Her hood had fallen, revealing a mess of curly hair and a pale, delicate face worn thin by fatigue. Beneath the dust and city grime, her dark eyes were wide and steady, not defiant, not pleading, just watching him, as if trying to read the man standing there and guess what he might do next. Richard moved forward slowly, raising a hand not to calm her, but more as a signal of caution. He saw his familiar wallet held tightly to her chest. He didn't speak at first. A conversation had already begun in his mind, one that had little to do with petty theft and everything to do with something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. He realized then he was afraid, not of losing money or face, but of hearing something that might change everything. The girl swallowed hard, her throat likely raw and dry, and when she finally spoke, the words came out so faint, Richard almost didn't hear them. I wasn't going to keep it. I just needed the cash, just a little. Her voice was hoarse, not from crying, but from what sounded like too many words spoken into ears that never listened. He stayed where he was. He didn't step closer, and he didn't reach for his phone. The girl gripped the wallet more tightly, then slowly extended it toward him. Her hand was thin, her fingers caked with dirt and trembling. Richard didn't take it right away. His eyes dropped to her small legs, to the worn-out sandals, barely held together with a bit of plastic string, to the jeans torn at the knees not by style, but by use, too many days worn without relief. And on her left arm, faint but unmistakable, a scar not yet fully healed, long and pale against her skin. He asked, softly, "What did you need the money for?" She looked away, then turned back to him. "My mom is sick, really sick. I needed to buy medicine. I tried asking. No one helped. There were no tears in her words, but something about the way she said them settled like stone in Richard's chest, cold and heavy, as if someone had slipped a block of ice into his ribs. She held the wallet out again, this time without hesitation, her eyes no longer measuring or bracing, only enduring. "I didn't want to steal from you, but I didn't know what else to do." He stepped forward and reached out to take it. She didn't flinch. When his fingers brushed hers, her skin was startlingly cold, not from the air, but from the absence of warmth itself. He looked down at the wallet in his hand. Everything was still inside. But the question now was no longer about the wallet. It was about the girl sitting in front of him, and the thing in her eyes that made it impossible to turn away. Richard stood still for a moment, his fingers lightly gripping the wallet just returned to him, as if it no longer held any real weight. In a city where people brushed past one another without so much as a glance, this moment pulled him into something he couldn't yet name. The girl remained seated, her gaze no longer combative, just quiet, the kind of silence worn by someone long used to not being believed. He exhaled, slow and deep, then spoke. "What's your name?" There was a pause, just a breath's hesitation. Then she answered softly, "Ellie." Richard nodded, his eyes still locked on the small face before him. Now he could see more clearly. The hollow in her cheeks from hunger, the faint smudges of exhaustion beneath her eyes, and the blood slowly drying on her scraped knee. He spoke gently. "Where's your mother?" Ellie didn't answer right away. For a few seconds, only the soft whistle of wind between the alley's walls could be heard. Then she stood. There was no defiance in her stance, only weariness. "If you want to call the police, I understand. But if you really want to know, then follow me." Richard said nothing, but his feet moved before his mind had fully caught up. She led him through the back streets, narrow alleys lined with trash, walls scribbled with layers of graffiti, the air damp and clinging to every breath. It had been a long time since Richard had stepped into places like these. He lived in the Upper East Side, where everything was polished, elevators had attendants, carpets were thick, and the air smelled faintly of expensive cologne. But here, every footstep seemed to carry him deeper into another world. They passed through an abandoned playground, where rusted swings creaked gently in the breeze. A broken bar had been tied back in place with an old power cord. The apartment where Ellie stopped was on the second floor of a crumbling brick building on the edge of Hell's Kitchen. The front was peeling, windows patched with duct tape holding together fragments of shattered glass. The wooden stairs groaned beneath their steps. Ellie didn't look back, as though she was used to climbing without anyone behind her. The apartment door was slightly ajar, not locked. Ellie pushed it open with a light touch, then glanced back at Richard with a look that wasn't an invitation, but also didn't refuse him. He stepped inside. The space was small and dim. Light filtered through a faded curtain, just enough to reveal water stains on the ceiling and yellowing walls. A torn sofa slouched in the corner. A crooked wooden table stood off balance. Overhead, a ceiling fan turned sluggishly, creaking with each rotation. There was no air conditioning, no television, no smell of food, only the scent of medication, dampness, and something Richard had never quite felt before: the silence of poverty. In the far corner, a narrow bed leaned against the wall, its blanket tangled. A woman lay there, thin, pale, hollow-cheeked, her hair damp with sweat and clinging to her forehead. She wasn't awake, but her chest rose and fell gently. Ellie moved quickly to her side, smoothing the blanket, wiping her mother's brow with a worn cloth fraying at the edges. Richard stood frozen in the doorway, unsure whether to take another step. It felt like he was trespassing into something sacred, a world he'd only ever heard of in statistics and headlines, never truly seen. The girl turned to him, her voice quiet but steady now. "My mom's a nurse. She used to work in a nursing home. Then she got sick. Heart problems, lost her insurance. They let her go. I tried everything. I went to the church, asked for medicine, went to the help center. No one gave me anything. They said I needed an adult. But my mom can't get up." As Richard listened, It felt as if someone were peeling away each careful layer he'd built around himself over the decades. He looked at the woman lying there and saw, for a moment, his own wife, lost to cancer. And for the first time since that moment in the street when he had been bumped and robbed, he felt a deep, sharp ache in his chest, not because of the wallet, because he had just come face to face with something raw and unvarnished, a child trying to hold on to her mother by any means necessary, even if those means had no place in the world he'd come from. Richard didn't know how long he'd been standing there. Every movement in the room seemed to slow, as if this space existed in a different rhythm, a separate pocket of time. Ellie sat beside the bed, her small hand resting gently on her mother's, whispering something he couldn't hear. The woman didn't stir. Her eyes remained shut, her skin so pale that even the dim light from the window couldn't bring back color to her face. Richard stepped closer, carefully, trying not to let the sound of his shoes break the hush that blanketed the room. As he neared the edge of the bed, he saw the contours of her face more clearly. Her cheeks were hollow, her lips cracked and dry, her hands thin with every bone and joint pronounced beneath the skin. An inhaler sat on the rickety nightstand beside her, next to a few empty pill bottles and a plastic jug of water, barely a third full. Everything in the room was tinted a faint, lifeless gray, not only from the light but from the weariness that clung to each object like dust. Ellie looked up as he approached. She didn't speak, only dipped her head in a quiet, instinctive gesture that felt like gratitude. Richard nodded in return, still wordless. He was trying to piece it all together. A child roaming the streets of Manhattan, not looking for trouble, not trying to buy drugs or waste money on nonsense, but desperately reaching for a chance to give her mother one more breath, one more day. He glanced down at the wallet now tucked back in his coat pocket. It felt heavier than ever. Sandra Carter, the woman lying there, had once been a nurse. Ellie had told him that. She had once helped others, cared for the elderly in their final days, offered comfort and dignity where little remained. And now, when it was her turn to need someone, the world had stepped aside. Richard lowered himself into the plastic chair beside the bed. It creaked faintly under his weight, the sound somehow out of place in the stillness. He asked quietly, "Is she like this often?" Ellie nodded. Every time her heart tightens, she passes out for hours, sometimes the whole day. I used to call an ambulance, but after 2 visits without insurance, they said they won't come again unless it's an emergency. Richard turned to look at her. There was no fear left in Ellie's eyes, only the quiet exhaustion of a child who had lived too long in worry and helplessness. "What do you eat?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. Ellie looked down, unsure. "I have bread and canned beans, sometimes instant noodles. A neighbor gave me an apple once. She's nice, but it doesn't happen much." Richard leaned back slightly, still watching the still figure in the bed. The woman had no idea who he was, no idea what her daughter had just done to buy her a little more time. But he knew, and that made it impossible to turn away, to leave and pretend he had seen nothing. He thought of his wife. The nights he had sat beside her hospital bed, sleepless, listening to the rise and fall of a machine, to each shallow breath, hoping for more time, bargaining with the silence. He had spent more than 30 years with the woman he loved, and even with all his money, all his connections, he had felt helpless when her body began to fail. And now, standing here, a part of that same fear echoed back at him through the eyes of a girl not yet 14. The room fell quiet again. The ceiling fan kept turning, but slower, as if pulled by the weight of what hung in the air. Richard stood. He straightened his jacket, the motion automatic. Ellie watched him, waiting for something, anything. He didn't speak right away. Words felt too small. But then, after a moment, he said quietly, "Your mom needs a doctor, and we're going to get her one. Right now." Ellie didn't respond at first. She didn't shout or ask questions. She just looked at him, long and searching, trying to understand if what he said was real. And then, slowly, she nodded. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. But in that moment, her eyes held a light that no thank you could ever match. The ambulance arrived later than Richard had hoped, though not so late that it tested his patience. While waiting, he made a quiet but firm phone call to a doctor he knew at a private hospital in Midtown. the same hospital where he had once funded a specialized care wing. His voice was calm, unwavering. He didn't ask. He simply informed them that an emergency case needed to be admitted immediately. When the medical team stepped into the cramped apartment, Richard caught a flicker of surprise in their eyes upon seeing him there. His tailored suit stood out like an artifact from another world against the worn wallpaper and threadbare furniture, but no one said a word. They focused on Sandra checking her pulse, starting an IV, lifting her gently onto the stretcher. Ellie stood close, her hand wrapped tightly around her mother's until the very last moment, until the wheels of the stretcher turned and carried her out of the room. She moved to follow, but paused when Richard placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. He met her gaze and said simply, "Come with me. We'll go right after your mom." On the ride to the hospital, Richard sat in the back of his car, Ellie beside him. Through the windows, the Bronx slowly gave way to Midtown. The shuttered storefronts, weathered bodegas, and graffiti-stained walls began to disappear, replaced by polished facades, glowing, neon signage, and immaculate glass fronts. The change was so stark that Ellie couldn't hide her reaction. Her eyes darted from one sight to the next, wide and uncertain, as if she were entering a world made entirely of light and glass. Richard watched too, but his mind wasn't on the passing buildings. He was thinking of things he'd never before questioned. For years he had lived in a world of ownership of assets, of influence, of time itself. And beside him now sat a child, who just hours ago had been running for her life through alleyways, who belonged to an entirely different world, a world without choice, without voice, a world where survival required silence, submission, and sometimes even theft. Between them lay a distance far greater than a train ride from the Bronx to Manhattan. It was the distance between two realities, one where a phone call at midnight could move mountains, and another where a child had to steal just to buy her mother one more breath. Richard had never imagined himself here, in this seat, between these two worlds, carrying with him a child who had never known safety, moving toward something he himself could not yet define. But when he glanced sideways and saw Ellie sitting rigid, her hands clenched on her knees, her lips pressed into a tight line, her eyes fixed straight ahead, he understood. She wasn't waiting for a promise. She didn't need speeches. She just needed a chance. And for the first time in years, Richard no longer felt like the man in control, no longer the one who held the cards. He was simply a human being, caught in the fragile space between right and wrong, between wealth and want, between hope and despair. A single, fleeting moment in a city that never stopped moving, but one that might just change the rest of his life. When the ambulance pulled up in front of the emergency entrance at New Horizon Private Hospital, two paramedics quickly wheeled Sandra's stretcher through the automatic doors. The brightness inside was almost blinding, the sterile scent of antiseptics thick in the air. Voices called out for nurses, heels clicked urgently across the polished tile floor, and everything around them carried the quiet chaos of a place constantly fighting for time against death. Ellie followed closely, her eyes locked on her mother's pale face, paper white under the harsh light. But this time, she didn't move like someone afraid of being seen or caught. She walked with purpose because she wasn't alone. Beside her stood Richard Callahan, a man she had only learned the name of less than an hour ago, but who now stood beside her like a quiet, immovable pillar. A young doctor approached, dressed in a crisp white coat, her dark hair tied neatly back, her name badge reading Megan Lee. Her eyes met Richard's in recognition. She gave a small nod, then immediately turned her attention to the patient. In a calm, practiced voice, she directed the nurses to monitor Sandra's heart rate, check her blood pressure, run blood work, and ready the intensive care unit. Richard stood just outside the path of the flurry, not interfering, but watching every movement with a sharpness that made it feel as though he were holding onto the thread of life himself. Ellie was gently but firmly stopped at the threshold by a nurse. She was told she couldn't go any farther. She didn't argue. She simply turned to Richard as if waiting for permission or assurance. He nodded. She sat down on a cold plastic chair in the long corridor, her fingers clutching the drawstrings of her hoodie, shoulders curling inward, trying to disappear into herself. Richard sat beside her without a word. He knew better than to speak. There was nothing to say that wouldn't feel hollow. He had once sat in this very hallway, 3 years ago, when his wife underwent her final surgery. He remembered exactly what it felt like to give over a loved one's life to the hands of strangers. The smell, the waiting, the helplessness. Dr. Megan emerged after nearly 30 minutes, her expression grave. She spoke quietly to Richard, but Ellie watched their every movement, her eyes searching for signs, her face pale and tense. "Sandra's heart condition is severe," she said. "Part of the heart muscle has been damaged for some time. She's in advanced heart failure." Megan didn't sugarcoat it. Standard medication is no longer effective. They were keeping her stable with oxygen support and IV drugs, but the prognosis was fragile. There was, however, an option. A new treatment, recently approved for clinical trial in the United States, developed in Switzerland. A medication designed to help restructure damaged cardiac muscle, allowing the heart to pump more effectively. But it wasn't covered by insurance, and more importantly, it required a legal guardian's consent to accept the risks. Megan's tone was clear, professional, measured. Richard said nothing. Around him, the hospital seemed to go still. He had heard of treatments like this before, expensive experimental drugs mentioned in board meetings, attached to funding decisions and venture capital reports. But now, it wasn't a case study. It wasn't a name on a chart or a line in a budget. It was a woman lying behind a glass door. It was a child sitting beside him, and it was a choice that no one else could make. Ellie rose suddenly and came to stand beside him. Her voice trembled. "What is it?" "If there's a chance, please." Richard looked at her. There was no fear in her eyes now, no caution, no hesitation, just the plea of a heart too young to have already known so much loss. He turned to Megan, then back to Ellie. And in that instant, the only question in his mind was this: if not me, then who? If not now, then when? And the answer, at last, was clear. Richard walked slowly out of the hospital corridor, his shoulders heavy with the weight of a decision he had never imagined himself making. The fluorescent lights above cast a cold, clinical glow, and the polished stone floor reflected his distorted silhouette like a mirror to the turmoil unraveling inside his mind. Megan had handed him the consent form, over 10 pages long, filled with legal clauses, side effect warnings, statistical risks, percentages of recovery, and one bolded line near the bottom: insufficient data to guarantee long-term efficacy. He had read every word, every line, but what he saw most clearly wasn't written on paper. It was in Ellie's eyes. A child who didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't plead. She simply stood there, quiet, like someone who had grown used to hope being something too fragile to hold on to. She never asked him to help. But in that silence, Richard found himself unable to walk away. He returned to the waiting area, where Ellie still sat, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had turned white. He handed her a bottle of water from the vending machine without a word. She took it, nodded softly, and looked down. He sat beside her and let out a long breath. He had once made decisions that moved hundreds of millions of dollars, once overseen companies that spanned continents, once faced down reporters, lawyers, politicians. But now, in the hush of an emergency room at night, he felt like a man stepping into real life for the very first time. He looked over at Ellie and asked gently, "If the doctors give her that treatment and it doesn't work, will you regret it?" Ellie turned toward him, her eyes steady, no hesitation. "If we don't try, she'll die. I have nothing left to lose." Her voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that clutched at his chest. He nodded slowly. That was what he needed to hear, not to convince himself, but to be certain this wasn't a decision he was making alone. This was a step they were taking together, two people from entirely different worlds, now standing on the same line. Richard stood, adjusted his jacket. When he stepped back into Dr. Megan's office, his hand no longer trembled. He signed the consent form, slowly but firmly, each stroke of the pen sinking into the paper like a record of something far greater than a signature. It was the beginning of a shift of a man who had lived his life wrapped in certainty, now placing his trust in something completely beyond his control. Megan looked up at him through her thin glasses and gave a small nod. "We'll begin the preparations." He asked once more, almost by instinct, "Does she have a chance?" Megan answered without pause. She does if her body responds, but we'll only know in the next few hours. Richard stepped out again, returning to the hallway. Ellie was waiting, as if she had known he would come back with an answer. She didn't ask, didn't guess. She simply looked at him. He nodded. She exhaled, softly, as though she'd been holding her breath all day. They sat down, together again, side by side, in silence. At that moment, time was no longer measured in minutes or hours, but in heartbeats. And as he waited, Richard realized the most important truth. It wasn't about what he was risking. It was about what he was stepping into, something that, for the first time, wasn't part of a plan, didn't yield a return, didn't guarantee a result. It was simply right, and for the first time in his life, that rightness came not from a boardroom, not from a contract, not from anything he could control, but from a girl he had never met before today, who might just change him for the rest of his life. The pen in Richard's hand was still warm with his grip when he set it down on the cold glass surface of the doctor's desk. The consent form was signed. His name now rested at the bottom, beneath dense lines of medical terminology and legal disclaimers, like a full stop at the end of a sentence that could not be rewritten. He stared at the paper for a few more seconds, not to reread it, but to steady himself, to let the weight of what he had done settle fully into his bones, to believe, without doubt, that he had done what needed to be done. When he stepped back into the hallway, Ellie was still in the same place. Her back was slightly hunched, her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the metal door behind which her mother lay. No one had asked her to stay, no one had told her to wait, but she hadn't moved, not even once. Richard sat beside her. He placed his hand gently on her shoulder, barely a touch, as though asking a question in silence. Ellie turned to him, and in her eyes was a flicker, a search, as if trying to find the truth before he even said it. He nodded. "It's done. You've done everything you could." His voice was low, but soft. Ellie didn't answer. She gave a small nod, then turned her gaze back to the door. Not a single tear fell, but Richard could see it, that crushing fatigue weighing down her small frame. A weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. It was the kind of tired that came from carrying too much fear, too much waiting, for far too long. Dr. Megan returned not long after, informing them the medical team was preparing for the experimental injection. Final tests were underway, and they had about an hour before it would begin. She suggested they take a break in the private family waiting area. Richard nodded, but when he turned to Ellie, she shook her head. "I want to stay here." He understood. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the wallet, no longer a symbol of what had been taken from him, but now the beginning of everything. He opened it and drew out a small white card. It was a hospital access badge, something rarely given to anyone outside the medical staff and certain board members. He handed it to her. "If you want to be closer later, show this to any nurse. They'll know." Ellie took the card, her hand trembling slightly. She looked up at him, not with a smile, not with words, but with a gaze full of something deeper than thanks, something unspoken and quietly profound. Richard looked away, not wanting her to see the redness beginning to rise in his eyes. He wondered how, in just a few hours, he could feel so connected to a child he had never known. Maybe it was because she had asked for nothing, never complained, never blamed anyone. All she had held on to fiercely simply was the life of her mother. And that, to Richard, was the most real thing he had encountered in years, far beyond the sharp-edged negotiations and gain and loss arithmetic of the world he lived in. Time moved slowly in the white corridors of the hospital, the intercom announcing names, the rhythm of footsteps, the faint hum of breathing machines from distant rooms. Together they formed a kind of music known only to places that measure life in moments. Richard sat in silence next to Ellie. He didn't check his phone, didn't respond to emails, didn't glance at the market news. He just sat, present, still, a part of the waiting. And in that quiet, he knew with absolute clarity, the signature he left behind wasn't just for an experimental treatment. It was a promise, to himself, to Ellie, to a part of him he had long believed had gone silent, a part that could still feel, still stop, still listen to the quiet voices that call to us when we dare to look beyond ourselves. The special waiting room sat at the end of the third-floor hallway, tucked away from the usual clatter and urgency of the emergency wing. It had been designed for families awaiting news from critical surgeries, softened by warm amber lighting, cushioned chairs instead of cold plastic, and a corner with a small kettle and a few boxes of peppermint tea. But for Richard and Ellie, no thoughtful detail could truly make the air easier to breathe. They sat beside one another near the window, behind them the city still glowing, still moving, as if nothing had happened. Cars drifted along the avenue below, pedestrians hurried past under neon signs, restaurants buzzed with light and motion. The world had not paused for the woman fighting for breath in a room down the hall, nor for the child sitting motionless in a room that smelled faintly of antiseptic. Ellie sat curled in on herself, arms wrapped around her knees, gaze cast toward the city lights beyond the glass. Her hair, loosely tied back, had slipped into a tangled mess, and the faded hoodie she wore made her seem even smaller in a room not meant for children like her. Richard looked at her once, then away. He didn't want to disturb the silence between them, a silence that was not oppressive, but thick with unspoken weight, the kind of silence that wraps around those who know what it is to wait, to endure time not in hours but in uncertainty. Every so often, a nurse passed through the hallway just outside. Each time, Ellie lifted her head, hope briefly, flickering in her eyes before fading again. She never asked questions, never begged for news. She just kept waiting, quietly. Richard remembered the first time he sat in this very room, also waiting. It had been during his wife's second heart surgery. He had read through 3 medical magazines, drunk 5 cups of lukewarm coffee, and eventually sat in stillness, not knowing what to hope for, not even sure what to fear most. He had thought, back then, that he had learned to live with uncertainty. But tonight reminded him that helplessness in the face of life and death is always new, always sharp. A nurse stepped in and placed 2 thin blankets on the table without a word. Richard took one and gently handed it to Ellie. She accepted it quietly, pulling it around her shoulders. Their eyes met for a brief moment, not with smiles or thanks, but with something deeper. A nod, a silent agreement. Between them, an understanding had formed. No explanation needed, no labels required, just the quiet language of shared endurance. Time passed in slow, steady ticks from the wall clock, each minute stretching as though the rest of the world rushed forward while this room hung suspended in waiting. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, focusing on his breathing, steadying it. He knew there was nothing more he could do right now, but still, he remained. Because if he left, Ellie would be alone. And that, to him, was unthinkable. Then Ellie spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper. "My mom's really good at what she does. She used to take care of a lot of old people. Some of them didn't have family. She told me once, an old man held her hand before he died. He thanked her for not letting him go alone." Richard opened his eyes and looked at her. Her voice didn't shake. It was calm, clear, and heartbreakingly steady. She went on, "I think if my mom has to go, I don't want her to be alone, but I don't want her to go. I never said I'm sorry for making her sad." Richard didn't answer right away. He reached over and placed his hand gently on hers. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "You've done something most adults wouldn't be strong enough to do, and your mom knows that." Ellie turned her head away and wiped quickly at her eyes. Silence returned, but this time it was softer, a quiet that let them breathe, a silence that didn't feel like grief, but something gentler, like the world offering a moment of stillness to hold on to each other, and in that moment, Richard understood something he hadn't before. Some waits are not measured by outcomes, but by who we choose to walk through them with. The emergency room doors flew open at the very moment the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway. Richard and Ellie rose at once, startled, their bodies reacting before their minds could catch up. Dr. Megan appeared, her mask pulled loose under her chin, strands of damp hair clinging to her temples. Her eyes sharp with urgency and fatigue. There was no need for warning. Richard already knew. Something was wrong. Megan didn't stop. She spoke quickly, her voice tight. Her condition just turned critical. Her heart stopped. "We're resuscitating. Please wait here." And then she was gone, disappearing behind the automatic doors that slammed shut with a mechanical finality, sealing them out. In that instant, the world seemed to fall silent. Ellie stood frozen, unmoving, her mouth parting as if to speak, but no sound came. She turned toward Richard, and he could see the question forming in her eyes, raw, helpless, desperate. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, feeling her small frame begin to tremble. He didn't speak. He only held on, steady, as though anchoring her from collapse. Inside, time had collapsed into seconds. The crash cart stood ready. A defibrillator was already in place. Megan's voice was calm but clipped, counting down, directing the team. The first jolt struck Sandra's chest, snapping her frail body upward, then back down again. The monitor stayed flat. A long, piercing tone held in the air. No rhythm, increase voltage, try again. A second shock. Still no response. The silence in the room grew so thick it felt like something alive. Each breath from the staff felt like it echoed in the walls. Megan glanced at the clock. Every passing second stretched the line between life and something that could never be reversed. Once more. The third shock hit. Sandra's chest lifted again, her body convulsing against the bed, then fell still. And then at first, almost imperceptible, a single beep. Another, and then rhythm. Slow. Faint. But there. Megan exhaled deeply, her voice now firm as she ordered the team to stabilize the patient, monitor vitals, support oxygen. They had pulled her back. Sandra was alive. Outside, Richard stood motionless, eyes fixed on the closed door. Ellie had sunk into her chair, her face buried in her hands. She didn't sob aloud, but her entire body trembled with the release of emotion too long held in. Richard sat beside her. He didn't speak. He didn't try to comfort her with platitudes. There were no words that fit in moments like this. He simply stayed with her. Moments later, the doors opened again. This time, Megan walked calmly, no rush in her step. She pulled her mask down and offered a small smile, just a flicker, barely there, but in that room and in that moment, it carried the weight of 1,000 reassurances. Her heart's beating again. We got her back. Ellie shot to her feet as if the floor itself had pushed her upward. Can I see her? Megan nodded. Just for a bit. She's not awake yet. But you can sit with her. Ellie turned to Richard, looking for approval, for permission that wasn't hers to ask but his to give. He met her eyes and nodded. Go. She'll feel you there. Without another word, Ellie walked quickly toward the room. The door closed behind her, and for the first time all night, Richard was alone. He exhaled slow, deep, like he hadn't let go of breath in hours. He leaned back into the chair, as if something long held inside had finally lifted. And yet he knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a long road. Life does not simply return with the beat of a heart. It needs time, care, relentless effort, and 1,000 things he'd never learned how to give. But now he would, because one thing was certain. When Sandra opened her eyes again, what she would see would not just be the white glare of hospital lights overhead. She would see her daughter, seated quietly at her side, holding her hand. And behind that small, fierce child, a stranger. A man who had nothing to gain and everything to lose, but who still chose to stand in the space between life and death and say yes. And sometimes, all it takes for someone to keep going is knowing that somewhere, someone still believes they are worth saving. The intensive care unit was silent, as if the room itself were holding its breath for everyone watching from the outside. Sandra lay motionless, her chest rising and falling in slow, mechanical rhythm, assisted by the steady pulse of the ventilator beside her. Numbers blinked faintly on the monitor, shifting gently, quietly, unmistakable proof that life was still present, however fragile, however thin the thread. Ellie sat at her mother's bedside, her small hand wrapped around Sandra's, her head resting softly against the edge of the bed, as though leaning just a little closer might be enough to transfer her love into that weary body. She didn't cry. She didn't speak much. Just soft murmurs now and then, sometimes apologies, sometimes memories. A child's way of holding on to what matters before it slips away. Richard stood behind the glass wall, watching. He didn't go in. He didn't need to. He knew this moment belonged to them. and he was only the one who arrived when it mattered, not earlier, not later, just in time. A young doctor approached and handed him a chart. The readings were stabilizing. The response to the medication was encouraging, though uncertainty still loomed large ahead. Richard nodded, eyes never leaving the mother and daughter beyond the glass. He understood. What they had fought for wasn't a miracle. It wasn't the return of full health, it was time. Another day, maybe weeks, maybe if they were lucky, months. Time enough perhaps for Ellie to say all the things she had held inside. Time enough for Sandra to wake, to see her daughter smile without fear that the next sunrise might be their last together. Time enough for Richard to realize that sometimes giving away just a small portion of what you have, your access, your name, your presence, can create something no wealth can measure. He let out a long breath and turned, walking slowly down the quiet hallway washed in, soft golden light. He knew, without question, that he was no longer a bystander to this story. He was a part of it now. And what he had helped purchase that night wasn't part of any business deal. It was time. That rarest and most precious currency, the one no fortune can buy. Only the heart can give it. The afternoon light had shifted by the time Richard returned to the ICU after a brief rest in his office. Sandra still had not woken, but her vital signs had begun to stabilize. Ellie, for her part, had barely moved from the room. All morning she had sat beside the bed, her small hand occasionally brushing her mother's arm in a soft, rhythmic motion, like a thread keeping love from unraveling. Richard handed her a warm cup of milk just as a knock came from the door behind them. Both turned at once. A nurse stepped in, followed by two uniformed police officers, one man, one woman. Their expressions were firm but not unkind, their eyes scanning the room before settling on Richard and Ellie. The male officer spoke. "We're sorry to interrupt. We're from the NYPD. The hospital staff notified us regarding an unaccompanied minor present in the ICU. However, when we ran a check on her description, it matched a report filed yesterday morning about a stolen wallet. The victim listed is a Mr. Richard Callahan." Richard stood, without hesitation. "I withdrew the report. The matter is resolved. There's no need to continue the investigation." The female officer flipped open a small notebook, scanning a few lines. "We don't have any record of that withdrawal. According to our system, the case is still open." Ellie's grip tightened around the cup of milk. Her eyes widened. Whatever warmth had just begun to return to her face vanished all at once. She took a small step back, the instinct to defend herself rising without thought. Richard stepped forward, placing himself fully between her and the officers. "I filed the report, and I'm asking for it to be closed. She's not a suspect anymore. She's the child of a patient in critical condition. If you need legal documentation, I'll sign it." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. The female officer looked at him carefully. "You're the complainant, yes. But because there was a public pursuit and the minor has no legal guardian present, this has exceeded the scope of a personal report. We're obligated to document her current condition, confirm whether she's been abandoned or if she's living in a potentially harmful environment." Richard's jaw tightened. The question was technically fair, but it was cruel in timing. He lowered his voice, and this time it was more plea than demand. "I don't know what your procedure requires, but this child did something most adults wouldn't dare. She tried to save her mother with everything she had, even if it meant crossing a line. If this has to be documented, then let me be listed as her temporary guardian. I have the financial means, legal standing, and medical connections to ensure she's protected." Ellie looked up at him, confusion clouding her face. She didn't understand the legalities, but her eyes were searching for the truth in his words, asking silently if what she had just heard was real. The male officer sighed, exchanging a glance with his partner. The hesitation was brief but clear. Finally, the woman gave a small nod. "All right, but we'll need to file a temporary guardianship statement, and you'll need to sign the form acknowledging legal responsibility for a minor in the absence of a parent. We'll also conduct a follow-up on her welfare and living conditions over the next few weeks. If there are any red flags, custody will be revoked, and she'll be placed in protective care." Richard nodded without pause. "I'll comply fully. Just make sure she's not taken away. She's been through enough." The officers completed their initial report, noted the change in status, and left quietly. When the door closed behind them, the room settled into a new kind of stillness, not the silence of fear, but the quiet that follows a promise spoken aloud. Ellie sat down beside Richard. She didn't say anything at first, only looked at him for a long time, as though trying to memorize the shape of what just happened. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I didn't think anyone would ever do something like that for me." Richard met her eyes, his voice calm and certain. "Now you know, and while you're here, you won't have to be afraid again." In that simple exchange, something shifted, something deeper than protection, broader than legal guardianship. It was the beginning of trust, and maybe even something more enduring, family, not by blood, but by choice. The next day, Richard sat in the administrative office of the hospital across from two representatives from the New York City Department of Family and Children's Services. The room was small and neatly kept with a window overlooking the hospital garden, but the atmosphere inside was taut with unspoken tension. One young employee typed steadily on a laptop, while the other handed Richard a stack of papers. On the table lay the emergency guardianship documents, an official file outlining the temporary custody of a minor in crisis. They had already verified his identity, run background checks, reviewed his tax records and housing conditions. Now, only a few signatures stood between Richard and the formal completion of the process. But these were not just lines at the bottom of a page. These signatures carried more weight than any contract he had signed in over 3 decades in business. He still remembered Ellie's face when the officer confirmed that Richard would be her legal guardian for the time being. It hadn't been surprise, or even relief, not quite. It was something quieter, more fragile. A cautious look soaked in disbelief, the kind of hesitation that comes from a life where good things often proved temporary, or worse, deceptive. As he signed the final page, a strange feeling welled up in his chest. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't hesitation. It was clarity, the momentary, absolute understanding that he had just stepped through a door into a life he had never planned to enter. Not a life of financial or legal responsibility, but one of presence, patience, and something harder to define, but easier to feel care. When he stepped out of the office, Ellie was sitting quietly outside, her back resting against the white wall, a small notebook in her lap, something a nurse had given her. She looked up as he approached, her eyes searching his face for something important, something she couldn't name. He paused, offered a small smile. "You're staying with me. There's no group home. No one's taking you anywhere." Ellie didn't respond right away. She gave a single nod, then stood and followed him without a word. They returned to Sandra's room. She still hadn't woken, but her complexion had improved and her heart rate held steady. The doctors remained cautiously optimistic, believing she might regain consciousness in a few days. But for now, the most critical thing was making sure Ellie had enough strength to keep holding on until her mother opened her eyes again. That evening, for the first time, Richard brought Ellie home to his apartment on the Upper East Side. The black SUV glided past towering buildings, their windows glittering like stars scattered across steel. Ellie sat in the passenger seat, clutching her worn backpack to her chest, her eyes darting around the city lights but saying nothing. When they arrived, a doorman in a sharp uniform greeted Richard by name. Ellie shrank slightly at the sight, instinctively cautious. Richard opened her door gently. "Come on, this is your home now." The apartment was expansive and filled with soft light, dark wood furniture, shelves lined with books, abstract paintings lining the hallway walls. Ellie entered like a stray cat wandering into a space too quiet, too polished, too unfamiliar. She didn't sit, didn't touch a thing. Richard stepped into the kitchen to boil water. A few minutes later, he returned and placed a mug of hot cocoa in front of her. She took it with both hands. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded and sat down across from her. "You can stay here as long as you need. Once your mom is better, we'll handle the paperwork properly. But first you need rest, food, and a place where you feel safe." There was a pause before she replied. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice barely more than a breath. "Because I'm not a very good kid." Richard looked at her without flinching. "Who told you that?" She didn't answer. He went on. You did everything you could to save your mother. That's enough for me. That's more than enough. Ellie dropped her gaze, her chin dipping as she tried to hide the tears beginning to form. In that vast apartment, high above the noise of New York, Richard felt something shift. For the first time in years, the space around him didn't feel empty. And Ellie, though she couldn't yet call it home, had found, perhaps for the very first time, a place where she wasn't pushed away at first glance. The next morning, sunlight poured gently through the sheer curtains, casting soft golden streaks across the polished wooden floor of the apartment. Ellie sat curled up in the large armchair in the living room, her frame small against its wide cushions. The mug of cocoa from the night before still sat untouched on the table, long since gone cold. From the kitchen, Richard emerged carrying 2 plates of warm toast. The buttery scent filled the air, rich and comforting. He placed 1 plate in front of her, then sat across the table. They ate in silence. It wasn't the heavy, uneasy silence of strangers anymore, but neither had it become the easy quiet of familiarity. It was something in between, tentative, fragile, still building. Richard chose his words carefully. Today I'm going back to the hospital. I'll meet with the doctors and get an update on your mom's condition. Do you want to come with me? Ellie nodded immediately, without hesitation. She had barely slept the night before. Each time her eyes shut, she found herself jolted awake by nightmares of her mother struggling to breathe, then disappearing down endless, blinding white hospital corridors. That fear still clung to her when morning came. After breakfast, they left the apartment. On the way, Richard took a call from Dr. Megan. Her voice was calm but carried a hint of cautious optimism. The good news was that Sandra had begun to show minor reactions to sound, not full consciousness, but the first real sign of progress. Ellie said nothing, but her grip on her backpack tightened, knuckles pale, as though holding fast to the faint thread of hope dangling before her. When they arrived at the hospital, Richard guided her to the now familiar waiting area. Ellie walked close to his side, the soles of her small canvas shoes making soft tapping sounds against the smooth stone floor. They stopped outside Sandra's room. Through the glass, her mother still lay motionless, though her complexion had improved. The oxygen tube remained beneath her nose, the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest helped by the machines. Ellie pressed her palm to the glass, eyes locked on her mother. Then, in a voice so soft it barely reached him, she asked, "If one day she wakes up and says she doesn't want me here, where will I go?" The question hung in the air like a breath held too long. Richard turned to her and for a moment didn't answer. He looked at her small face, the worry carved deep into eyes that had seen too many. Closed doors, too many hesitant hands. His voice, when it came, was quiet and steady. "If that day ever comes, you'll still have a place to go. Right here. With me." Ellie bit her lower lip, nodded slightly, though confusion still flickered behind her expression. Then she asked again, this time barely above a whisper, "Is this really home?" Richard nodded, slowly. "Maybe not today, but one day, yes. Because home isn't just where you live. It's where you don't have to ask permission to stay. It's where, no matter what right or wrong, someone will be there, waiting for you to come back. And I think you deserve that." Ellie didn't say anything. She turned back to the window and looked at her mother for another long moment. Then she turned again, and for the first time reached out and took Richard's hand. Her hand was small, thin, but warm, and there, in the sterile hallway of a New York hospital, a child who had never truly belonged anywhere, quietly discovered something more valuable than a roof over her head. She found what it meant to belong. Early mornings at the Central Park West apartment no longer echoed only with the quiet hum of the coffee machine or the click of Richard's polished shoes on hardwood floors. Now they carried softer sounds, Ellie's light footsteps in her oversized pajamas, the faint rustle of pages turning at the breakfast table, and occasionally the delicate lift of her laughter when something in a book pulled her mind, however briefly, away from the constant weight of worry. It had been a week since Sandra was saved and moved to the recovery unit. Though she had not fully regained consciousness, her vitals were strong, and her body was slowly healing. Each day, Ellie visited her mother, carrying little pieces of her new life, a funny story from the evening before, a recipe she wanted to try, a song she'd heard whispering them by her mother's bedside, even though there were no answers yet. Richard had rearranged his work schedule, trimming back meetings and deferring responsibilities he used to guard like sacred rituals. He hadn't expected to learn how to prepare breakfast for a 13-year-old girl or memorize a middle school lunch menu. Yet here he was, asking Ellie each morning whether she wanted toast or cereal, and finding a strange comfort in the way she now expected someone to be waiting for her in the kitchen. On a particularly quiet morning, Ellie was brushing crumbs from the table when Richard stepped out of his office, holding a small paper bag. Inside were a few new notebooks, a fountain pen, and a beautifully illustrated children's novel. He placed the bag gently on the table in front of her. "I enrolled you in a school nearby. Just public, but small classes, good teachers. You could start next week." Ellie sat slowly. She looked at the bag, then at him, her face unreadable. He understood. This wasn't just about going to school. For a child who had once fallen asleep in a damp apartment, unsure if there'd be a roof over her head the next day, school had become something distant, almost unreal, too stable to believe in. "You don't have to prove anything," he added gently. "Just be yourself. That's enough." Ellie gave a small nod. Then she opened the bag, pulled out the first notebook, and ran her fingers over the clean white pages. They reminded her of the days when life was simpler, sitting next to her mother at the kitchen table, doing math homework by the soft voice of an old radio in the background. Poor, yes, but with a kind of warmth that made the poverty feel survivable. Suddenly she spoke. "Can I cook dinner tonight?" Richard raised an eyebrow, then smiled. "You know how to cook?" She nodded. "I used to make potato soup for my mom. It wasn't very good, but she always said it was her favorite." He stepped toward the fridge and opened it. "Then we'll make it together. You're the chef. I'll be your assistant." Ellie laughed, a real laugh, and in that instant, the kitchen felt brighter. That afternoon, the scent of potatoes, onions, and black pepper filled the apartment. Ellie stood on a stool to reach the stovetop, carefully stirring while Richard stood beside her, jotting down each step as if she were a seasoned chef sharing a secret recipe. When the soup was ready, they set the table and sat down to eat in the golden glow of evening sun that spilled through the windows. Ellie lifted her spoon, tasted it, and whispered, "It tastes like back then." Richard didn't ask what back then meant. He didn't need to. He simply ate beside her in silence, knowing that something precious had happened not just for her, but for him as well. These new mornings weren't just a beginning for Ellie. They were a beginning for Richard, too. A man who once believed success was measured by account balances was starting to see that real wealth lived elsewhere in a child's cautious trust, in the softness of a shared meal, in the small miracle of a girl learning to laugh again. In this home, mornings were no longer routine. They had become signs of life, of hope, and of something very close to love. On her first morning at the new school, Ellie stood silently in front of the mirror, dressed in the freshly issued uniform. A plain white blouse and a blue skirt, simple by most standards. But to her, it was the most formal outfit she had worn since the day her mother fell ill. Behind her, Richard waited by the door, holding the lunch bag he'd packed just minutes earlier. He watched her with a quiet, careful gaze, as if afraid to speak too loudly and break the fragile stillness that clung to her small frame. Before they stepped out, he said gently, "If anything makes you uncomfortable, just call me. I'll come right away." Ellie nodded but said nothing. She walked down the stairs, her shoes polished, backpack held close to her chest. The school was only about 10 minutes away by car. Richard drove her himself, pulling up near the large wrought iron gate that opened into the school grounds. He stayed in the car and watched her walk through, step by step, her figure shrinking into the crowd of unfamiliar faces. In class, Ellie took the seat at the back. She didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't try. During recess, she sat alone under a tree, pretending to read a book while the rest of the children clustered in groups, laughing and whispering among themselves. A group of girls passed by. One of them, a blonde girl with a voice just loud enough to be heard, turned and muttered, "I heard she's the one who got caught stealing. Cops came looking for her at the hospital. Total freak." Ellie gripped her book tighter. Her eyes dropped to the page. She didn't protest. She didn't run. She'd grown used to being misunderstood, used to wary glances, used to a world that never asked for explanations. When school let out, Richard was waiting outside. Ellie hurried to the car, got in, and shut the door without a word. He noticed the slight tremble in her shoulders. She didn't cry, only turned her face toward the window, eyes locked on the blur of passers-by on the sidewalk. Richard didn't ask what had happened. He only said, "There's a little place that makes the best waffles just around the corner. Want to try it?" Ellie didn't answer right away, but a few minutes later, she gave a small nod. They stopped at the quiet cafe, ordered 2 plates of waffles, and sat outside beneath the awning. Richard didn't look at her while they ate. He just talked. He told her how, on his first day in New York, people had made fun of his accent, his worn-out suit, his strange ideas. He told her he knew what it felt like not to fit. He didn't offer advice, didn't try to explain the world. He just let his story sit between them like a second plate on the table. When they finished, he handed her a napkin. Ellie wiped her mouth, then said in barely more than a whisper, "I don't want to go back there. They don't like me." Richard looked at her for a long moment before answering. "You don't need them to like you, not right away. But you can't disappear either. Because your being there matters. You're not intruding. You're not lost. You belong wherever you choose to stand. And if no one's told you that today, then let me be the first. You belong in this world as much as anyone else." She looked at him, her eyes steadier now. And for the first time since that morning, Ellie smiled a small, quiet smile, like a sliver of sunlight breaking through a heavy cloud. On the way home, she turned and asked, "Were you ever scared of not fitting in anywhere?" Richard nodded. "Every day. But I learned that sometimes, to stay, you just need one person willing to wait for her. You to find your place." He looked at her and added softly, "I'll be that person for you." Ellie turned back to the window, but this time not to hide. This time she smiled to herself just a little. And in that quiet ride through the city, something shifted. For the first time, Ellie let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she had a place in this world, one that no one could take away. That afternoon, just as they returned from the little bookstore near Columbus Square, Ellie cradled a small potted plant carefully in her arms. It was a young lemon tree, not even half a meter tall, with tender green leaves and a soft fragrance that drifted through the air like the summer afternoons Mrs. Sandra used to talk about. Richard had told her she could pick any plant she liked, but Ellie hadn't needed much time to decide. "I want to plant a lemon tree. My mom used to say that if she ever had a garden, the first thing she'd grow would be lemons." Richard nodded, signaled the clerk to wrap the pot gently, then motioned for the driver to open the car door. When they arrived home, they placed the little tree on the largest windowsill in the apartment, right where the morning sunlight came in gently and warm. Ellie named the tree Lemonita. She took a piece of colored paper, drew a tiny name tag, stuck it to the rim of the pot, then stepped back a little, tilting her head to make sure it looked just right. After that, she began talking to Lemonita about all the small things that had happened during her day. She told the tree about the good grade she got on her essay about family, about the soup Richard made for dinner the night before, exactly the way her mother used to, and about how she had raised her hand to speak in class, even though it still trembled. Richard watched quietly from his study. Lemonita was more than just a plant. It was a symbol of hope, of something quietly growing inside Ellie day by day. That evening, Ellie sat at her desk with colored pencils and a small ruler, drawing for hours. When Richard came in to wish her good night, she handed him a piece of paper. On it was a picture of an apartment that looked just like theirs. In the picture stood 3 figures side by side, a man with salt and pepper hair holding a coffee cup, a woman resting on a sofa wrapped in a light shawl, and in the middle, a little girl with brown hair holding Lemonita. At the bottom, written in uneven green crayon, were the words, "My family." Richard stared at it for a long time, his throat suddenly tight. He said nothing, just bowed his head and wrapped Ellie in an embrace that spoke for him. In the world that had once been cold and lonely for the little girl, a tiny seed had just begun to sprout, and it did not grow from soil alone. It grew from quiet, honest moments, from a lemon tree named Lemonita, from a drawing made of hope, and from a trust that was being built one day at a time out of love that asked for nothing in return. Several weeks had passed. That Sunday, the sky was clear and the sunlight gentle. It was a morning like any other, quiet and unremarkable to the world outside, but to Ellie and Richard, it was the first time this place truly felt like home. The warm scent of toasted bread drifted through the kitchen, mingling with the soft strains of jazz humming from the old speaker Richard had brought home from his office. Lemonita, the little lemon tree, leaned slightly toward the light streaming through the window, basking in the golden glow of early day. Sandra had awakened a few days earlier. She was still fragile, her body tired, but her smile had never faded. She sat on the sofa, a light shawl resting gently on her shoulders, her eyes shining as she watched Ellie dart around the dining table, setting out breakfast with the earnest care only a child can give. Richard poured himself a cup of coffee, added just a touch of brown sugar the way he liked it, and placed a quiet hand on Sandra's shoulder as a wordless greeting. She looked up and whispered, "Thank you," her voice still faint but her gaze full of warmth. Ellie sat down beside her mother, then looked up and asked Richard a question that held more weight than its words suggested. "Do you think we're really a family?" He paused for a moment, then nodded slowly. "We don't have to look alike to be a family. Family is the place where people choose to stay. It's where they go through the hardest things together and build something better side by side." Ellie was quiet for a moment, then gently set down her spoon and smiled. "This is my home. I can feel it." That simple, honest statement marked the end of one journey and the beginning of another. From what seemed like a chance chase through the streets of Manhattan, from a stolen wallet, from a frightened glance down a frozen alleyway, had come something no one could have predicted. The story today is not just about a billionaire and a little girl with nothing. It is proof that kindness doesn't need a reason, that sometimes a single decision, a single moment of choosing to listen instead of judge, can change an entire life. And more than that, it reminds us that often the ones who have been hurt the most are the ones who need love the most. Dear friend, wherever you are watching this story from, have you ever felt lost in a crowded city? Have you ever believed that you didn't belong anywhere? If you have, we invite you to share how you felt as you followed this story. Has it made you look at life a little differently? Has it brought to mind someone you once let slip away? Please leave a comment below. We want to hear your heart, because it is your emotions that give soul to every story we tell here at Emotional Echoes. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, to like and share this video so that these deep and human values can reach more people. Every single subscription from you is an encouragement for us to continue bringing stories that touch the heart. We look forward to seeing you in the next video with another story just as real and just as moving. Until then, we wish you and your loved ones good health, peace, and the kind of days where even the smallest moments bring a smile. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. Goodbye for now, and see you again soon.